A record-breaking Formula 1 2023 is in the books, and it's time to look back at what kind of season we just saw. I was personally entertained by it, but then again, I lived perhaps a little bit deeper into Formula 1 than some. I like the storylines, the tech storylines, the various human performance storylines. I'm Martyn Lee from the Autosport podcast, and I'm joined today by our own Jonathan Noble and Blake Hinsey, who is Brrrake in all the various places you can find him, former Formula 1 performance engineer. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the first of two parts as we look back on Formula 1 this year. And as I say, I enjoyed Formula 1 this year. There's so much to get into, whether it's the midfield battle, who's rising, who's falling. But I do have some friends, some other dad friends around this time of the year have said to me, have you got any more weekends working between now and Christmas? They've sort of not really tuned into Formula 1 more recently because they were lighter fans. So we'll investigate whether that phenomenon is real, whether some of the Netflix effect is wearing off, or whether Formula 1 is in as rude health as I think it probably is compared to previous years. Let's get into it. John, we have to start, John, with Red Bull and the record-breaking Max Verstappen. And for me, the word this year is consistency. Nobody in that team dropped the ball. There was no radiator cover left in on the way to the grid kind of human mistakes. It was just deeply impressive from Red Bull. How did you were there this year in the paddock. How do you reflect?
Yeah, I mean, by far the best car. They completely nailed it, understood the dynamics needed to make these Grand Effect cars work. But equally, this was about execution, because there were days and moments where they could easily have thrown it away. I mean, Singapore, they did throw it away. Wrong setup direction on the Friday. Didn't really recover. And by Sunday, when they finally worked out what was going on, too late to get back to the front. But other times, I think of Monaco. That was a race Fernando Alonso could have won. You get a Silverstone, the McLarens were mighty quick. Qatar, even Brazil, McLaren could have had that opportunity if Lando had been a bit more aggressive potentially in taking the lead. So, a mixture of a dominant car, Max Verstappen, absolutely brilliant, a Red Bull car, crushingly dominant, consistent, great on its tyres, all came together. But I don't think it wasn't a canter. It wasn't as if Max just rocked up in the paddock on a Thursday, twiddled his thumbs, got in the car and won the races. There was still an awful lot of work and brilliance behind it.
Honestly, I think John nailed all of that. The consistency is what was so impressive. And the blip on the radar for Red Bull was that, that dropping that ball that one time in Singapore. But everything else, if they were not 100% optimized on Saturday, by Sunday they got there. Towards the end of the season, we started to see a couple Mexico, Brazil, and then Vegas qualifying performances were dropping away slightly, but then they come back on Sunday and just more or less destroy everyone. I mean, some of them were more measured than others, but it was an impressive run throughout the entire season.
And for the entire team as well, what's it like working inside the pressure cooker of a Formula 1 team when, you didn't work there this year when it was a record-breaking Red Bull season with just, win after win. But we focus on the car, obviously. We focus on Max and Sergio Perez, obviously. But thousands of people put a campaign together. What's it like when you're inside that environment?
I think this year is probably one of those when everything is going right. And it's not because it's easy. It's because people are very good at the jobs, because there's lots of stuff that you don't think about. And if that person doesn't do their job properly, well, okay, those tires aren't ready, or this doesn't happen. And those are the kind of things that over a season, you come up looking slightly less than flawless or even losing out from an operational point of view. So being in the pressure cooker with a team that's operationally that slick as Red Bull is really enjoyable, because everybody is always firing on all cylinders. And even if one person does drop the ball to, humans make mistakes, but at the same time, the rest of the system can catch that, and they deliver every race weekend in terms of pit stops, decisions, communication protocols. And those are huge things that we don't get to hear at all. We don't hear any of the discussions that are happening on the pit wall, but they're talking about the right things on the pit wall more often than not, it seems.
John, what's your thoughts on the driver pairing at Red Bull at the moment? The history books will record that Sergio Perez got that second place in the Drivers' Championship. Hamilton ran him hard for that second place, but ultimately delivered what Red Bull have never been able to do before in a championship-winning year, which is to get that 1-2. Perez has had a fair share of criticism this year. He's also had some performances which led to that criticism, with people saying, well, look, in that RB19, why isn't he just, second behind Max? Because he's not as quick as a driver as Max Verstappen, week in, week out. What are your thoughts on the driver pairing, John?
I think you can't just view the Max Perez situation alone. I think you've got to understand these cars are, I think, quite difficult to understand, quite difficult to optimize, and the tyres are adding on to this complication. So you see it up and down the field. You look at Charles Leclerc, Carlos Sainz, even Lewis and George, that certain weekends, if they're front limited or rear limited or the balance slightly off, one of them, they don't mix around. One of them's 2-3 temps up the road and the other one's struggling. There's this flip around between the two. But I think what happened at Red Bull is it slightly exacerbated that Max found the sweet spot with the car. You're into a position where you've got the pace, so you don't have to push to the max. You're looking after your tyres, and it's this virtuous circle of brilliance which helped him all season, because you're not having to push super hard. You're not breaking a sweat. Your tyres are in the sweet spot, and the performance goes there. And if you're slightly on the back foot, you're pushing harder, your tyres are overheating, you're sliding more, the degradation's not as good, and it kind of spirals out of control. And I think that's what we saw at Red Bull. Sergio lost his way with this car. We know Max, can cope with a car on the way it handles with solid front end that other drivers struggle with. I've seen a few mentions recently. It's like someone likened it to the cursor on your mouse, that if you turn the sensitivity up to 1,000%, for example, and it's zipping all over the shop, that's how Max, the equivalent of Max driving a car, he can cope with the sensitivity being super, super high, and other drivers struggle with that. So I think we see that little difference there. I think Sergio went for a really bad patch, questions about his future, but he spent those 2-3 days at the factory before Austin. I think they worked through setup, try to understand things. I think he unlocked something towards the end of the year to show an improvement, not on the pace of Max like he was at the start of the year, but, getting there. And hopefully, he'll be a bit stronger and we'll have a bit more of a fight at the front in 24.
And Blake, give us your thoughts on the Red Bull driver lineup. So much talk about, well, he'll do half a season. That place can be brutal at times, and Ricciardo will be in that seat. But for me, Perez seems like an ideal second driver. Very, very experienced. I don't know what he's like at giving feedback, but I would presume very good at giving feedback and working with Max Verstappen. He's a family man. He's got some beautiful young children. He's in a different stage of his life. He'll never earn more money than this in his motorsport career. He's driving the best car in the top tier of motorsport. And he seems, for me, an ideal second driver. Now, whether it's in his contract, it probably is that you are the second driver and you'll yield to Max, those kind of things. For me, 2 more years of this rule set. If I were him, I'd have my eye on, doing that and having a great time in Formula One. But do you think Red Bull should or maybe could be more aggressive in a replacement strategy and bringing new people into the team?
That's a really tough one. And I think we've had that conversation several times throughout the season about the dynamic. Do you want 2 number 1 drivers going head to head, or do you want a 1-2 arrangement? This season, clearly in terms of performances, Max has had the advantage in single lap pace and race pace. And obviously when you don't qualify as well, you're not really there to put the fight. But we saw this with, was it Ferrari and Monza, that dynamic of like, you always have your cars right next to each other. And one weekend, the car suits Carlos versus Charles. And it's like, I'm faster, let me through. And they're like, no, we're not giving you guys team orders. And at one point, that's great for the sport to watch, the team battles, because that's, gave us a little bit more something to chew on this season. But at the same time, if you're Ferrari, I think you want to win the championship, the drivers or constructors. And if you have 2 drivers, potentially taking a position off of each other, which you could have gone, one of the cars could have, overtaken the car ahead. That doesn't look so clever. But I can't argue that I wasn't entertained at times, but sometimes I'm just let him through, please. You guys are definitely going to get another position out of that. I think that's the scenario that Red Bull are in right now. They don't have to deal with that. But let's say that the other cars like Ferrari, let's say next season, Ferrari magically sort their race pace, or McLaren are consistently thereabouts. They're going to start questioning that if Checo isn't closer to Max in terms of race pace, and they're losing out points to another team. They don't have that problem right now, so do they need to push the issue? I don't think so.
And before we leave Red Bull, I want to ask you both about 2024. I don't want to trip anybody up because predictions are impossible, and we've seen from Mercedes-Benz, the championship-winning teams can can struggle. And, Red Bull are losing some good senior people as well to other teams, and that has happened already. But let me look a little bit forward, because I think what Lewis Hamilton said recently, which is they haven't touched the car since July or August. They've been laser focused on 2024. Consistent rules now until 2026. It's deeply impressive. Blake, I'll stay with you. This is ominous for the competition.
Yeah, I would not be surprised. I mean, here's what you've got. Yes, you've got the sliding scale of wind tunnel development, which the better you do, the less time you get to develop. The playing field has more or less been leveled. I think most of the teams, especially at the sharp end, are on the budget cap. So, in your top 5 teams, I don't think anybody's under that. I could be mistaken, but I think they're all more or less pushing that the entire way. But what you've got with Red Bull is a team that's been able to have such an advantage and manage this from the outset. So when you make the right decisions philosophically and you have development paths that are good to add performance, it's typically easy to find more performance up to a certain point. And the question is, have they maximized this regulation set? Considering we've just finished year 2, and considering, the expenditures are 1/2 or 1/3 of what they used to be, I don't think we're close to the top of this. So in all likelihood, I think teams will be finding more chunks. Look at the amount of development we saw on McLaren this season. That it's not like the car was absolutely abysmal. I mean, it wasn't great to start, but it was tidying up a couple of bits. I think Red Bull are past the tidying up spots, and now it's, the deep dives, the philosophical, how is the car operating? All right, can we find more performance there? And one of the things they need to look at is low speed, which has been admitted by Max talked about that recently. And also the data is quite clear that they are at a disadvantage to Ferrari in the low speed corners. Sort that out. That will be terrifying.
I think what would be interesting is because we know the Red Bull focused its kind of setup and approach to Sundays that maximise the tyre life. You're running at the front or near the front. You're not pushing, and everything comes together. Is if the opposition, if Ferrari and Mercedes make a step and McLaren are up there, and Max suddenly isn't qualifying second in races, he's qualifying 5th and 6th, and then they can't afford to focus so much on the Sundays. They've got to sacrifice a little bit the Sundays. I wonder if there's just this. They're in the sweet spot at the moment where they didn't have to worry too much about Saturdays, that it was coming through, but only a tiny little tweak. You lose a tenth of the second now with everything being so close in Formula 1, and that's the difference between front row, third row, fourth row. Suddenly they've got to change their approach. Suddenly their Sundays are compromised a bit more. So I think they looked crushingly dominant at times this year, but I don't think it would take much to turn that situation around.
Yeah, I completely agree. And we saw that the midfield was super tight. And with teams like McLaren closing that, we're going to have another team in there. And, they are going to have all those operational things to consider. It's like, do you prep your tires in the right way? We saw many qualifying sessions determined how well people qualified. Did you read the situation right? Sprint weekends, when you have one session to set up, can you nail those weekends? I hope we see more pressure and more compromises having to be made, and that will, I think, make Saturdays and Sundays more exciting, honestly. I hope you're right, John. I'm praying for you to be right, honestly.
I think one of the things that annoyed people this year wasn't that Max won or Red Bull won all but one races. I think it's just the manner that it was so clinical. When Rossi was dominating MotoGP, he'd be, fighting in the pack and would wait till the final lap and overtake, and it would be a great spectacle, even though the result was the same. But I think Red Bull were just absolutely consistent, and you just knew there was an inevitability 9 times out of 10 that once the race was on, Max was going to win this. And I think that's probably, it's the manner of the wins rather than the number of wins is probably the thing that people didn't like so much.
Yeah, the lack of jeopardy, I think, was what kind of caught us out. It's like he's taken the lead and he's broken DRS 3 laps later. And if that happens at lap 5,
yes,
there's a lot of people turning off the television, which I can understand.
Blake, you mentioned philosophy, and that's interesting because car concept is one that dominated some of the most interesting storylines, I think, for this year. The last couple of years, actually, where I get a lot of my enjoyment of Formula One is looking at who's on the rise and who's falling. So, Blake, I'm sure everyone watching our channel knows exactly who you are, but for that one person who doesn't, your channel is all about reading into the data and finding the storylines, and often human storylines as well, but deep in the data, and you really bring that to life for mere mortals like me who watch your channel. So tell us, who started the season second best and who ended the season second best?
I think there's two parts to that question, and it's obviously these conversations are always nuanced, and I think we can start by saying single lap pace. It really looked like Ferrari started there, and at the end of the season, I think Ferrari ended the season second best on single lap pace. But the difference was the ability for them to translate those Saturday performances, like we discussed with Red Bull, into Sunday performances. And whether it's a deliberate choice or a property of the car, suspension, how stiff you have to operate it, how sensitive the car is aerodynamically. If you go, do you lose a lot of load when you get crosswind or there's gusts? And does that exaggerate the ability or the negative effect of wearing out your tires or overheating the tires more quickly that leads to more degradation? Ferrari struggled massively on Sunday. And if we look at them, they started off second best in single lap pace to Red Bull, and they just kind of held on there more or less throughout the season. They had a couple of blips at Japan and Qatar and Spain. They were quite a bit off, but for the most part, their single lap pace was there. And then you've got, when you go to the race, you've got operational issues. Did they make the right calls? Did the drivers fight each other too much and lose out on a result? Did they have DNFs? And all those things really stacked up to Ferrari's disadvantage, which I think pushed them back at the second half of the season. But as we still saw, they're still thereabouts, just not as consistent as we'd like them to be. And I think the same is true of Mercedes, kind of in that spot on Sunday. We didn't always know what we were going to get with them, despite the fact that their qualifying performances were, on average through the season, third best, with a very interesting standout at Hungary, Singapore, and Austin. So it's definitely Ferrari is the second fastest car, and I think that was an underperformance by them operationally in the Constructors' Championship to not cement that place.
John, let's pick at Mercedes just a little bit, because Mercedes have all the right things to recover and be champions again. They have all the right people, they have the right drivers, they have all the right budgets, they have an ownership structure, which means they're able to make decisions, and you have an owner there and team principal in Toto Wolff who's incredibly experienced and knows how to win, and importantly, set the culture to get back to winning ways. And if you look at the points, then say Lewis Hamilton, once again, that consistent point scorer of running Perez pretty close towards the end of the season for second place, which can disguise at times the problems they've got. But I've seen many people, John, I don't know if you agree or not, saying 2024 is a crunch year. If they can't recover next year, it could be a giant in terminal decline.
I don't know about terminal decline, but I think it is the opportunity and the proof of the work that's happened the last 2 years. You can briefly summarise the car over the past 2 years. Is first year of the regulations, they, along with everyone else, saw that the lower you run these cars to the ground, the more downforce there is. And if you're working in a wind tunnel, that's a very attractive prospect. So they went into the year thinking, we'll run the car super low down. Potentially the floor can flex down a bit and it'll seal off a little bit, even more downforce, and the performance is going to be amazing. They hadn't counted for porpoising, which everyone struggled with. Mercedes, worked on that car throughout last season, felt that they'd made some gains, and then coming into this season, aware of porpoising, they thought, well, we'll just play it conservative. We'll lift the car up, avoid the porpoising, and the performance will be there. But they went the wrong way. This was a year where actually people started running a bit lower to the ground because they could understand and manage it better, and Mercedes was leaving downforce performance on the table. And these cars as such, there's not one element of these cars that's secret. The Red Bull is, as Pierre Vache told me when I spoke to him in the summer, this car isn't brilliant in one area. It's just very, very good in lots of areas. And its weaknesses are less than the weaknesses of other cars, which I think we've talked about several times here. This this rule set isn't about how good your car is where it's strong. It's about how less weak it is in its weak areas, which is a bit of a kind of inverse way of judging it. And I think that was the Mercedes problem. So they know they need a new concept. They knew from day one of the Bahrain test that they got it wrong. They've revamped. But you're quite limited. Once you've committed to your aero platform with these cars, there's no scope to kind of rip up the drawing sheet and start again and roll out a B spec for Spain or British Grand Prix. You're pretty much stuck with it now for the year. So I think into 24, new concept, new parts, new approach, new understanding, new aero platform. And I think it's critical they make that step, because if they don't do it 24, there's little reason to think they'll understand more for 25, and then it's all new again for 26.
I think that's a super interesting point. The fact that, a lot of the stuff in this regulation set, once you've made you place your bets at the start of the season in terms of philosophies, especially if a lot of the stuff is baked into, like, for example, the side impact structures or something on your chassis, those are very, very expensive to change. And it's like, can we afford to build a new, a B-spec chassis, re-homologate it, and then redo all the bodywork around that? The answer is no, you can't, because you have all the other things that you have to spend money on throughout a season, as the fact that you've got 20 plus races. So I think that's a big thing. Is we talk about this is the hit rate. Does your concept agree with your tools? Do your tools predict reality well enough that you can take those simulations, build the physical components, and you can be confident they're going to work? And you've also built in enough scope that if it doesn't work exactly, you've got room to tweak those things up and down, be that how stiff your suspension is and how much travel you have, which was, I believe, one of their Mercedes problems last year. And then now it's still, the side pod, side impact structure, design philosophy that seems to be really limiting what they can change. They can't just do a miniature Red Bull this season, or whatever that looks like, if that was, the thing they wanted to do, because I don't know if that's possible. And I'm not an aero surfaces and aero design person, but you would think if it was possible to do that, they would have thrown, more crap at the wall effectively this season. But when most of the big, like, tuning dials, the windows are already set on those, and you're tuning them the best you can in those windows, they've done a good job of what they've got, but the potential isn't there.
Well, we've covered off why Ferrari and Mercedes were perhaps quick and less quick at times. Let's talk about another two teams as well, which, when I asked you who started and ended the year second quickest, viewers, listeners might be forgiven for thinking, well, that's an easy answer. Aston Martin were clearly second at the beginning, and McLaren were clearly second at the end of the season. But as you say, it's difference between one-lap pace and race pace. But that is a big storyline of 2023, which we can reflect on, which is how well Aston started. And then some changes happened through the year. Some parts of their car, they weren't running by the end of the year. And then and McLaren, of course, said, well, look, every bit of that car, certainly the aero surface, is all going to be changing by the end of the year. And they did what they've not been able to do in many recent seasons, which was to deliver on the promises and, to an extent, the hype around a great team like McLaren as well. They genuinely did deliver. Let's talk a little bit about those two teams, Blake and John, if we could. Blake, I'll start with you. Aston Martin really interested me because they started so well this year, and they're investing so much in that team. I was working at Silverstone last week, and I drove past. The development is looking almost complete. In fact, the big lit up kind of obelisk cognizant sign is now at the entrance. The waterfall and some stones or something. It's looking finished, and it's a reminder of the investment in Aston Martin. But they didn't end the season too well.
Yeah, I drove past Silverstone the other week, and the last time I drove through Silverstone, it was the old Force India building still, the same very small, modest building with, very little manufacturing on site. This is 10 years ago for me now, but I saw the Aston Martin building. I was like, oh my God, they've built a monster. But it now that outfit does look like a modern top tier Formula One team. They look super slick. They're spending the money. And they started, back to the point, they started off the season very impressively. And I think you, John, and I have chat several times about this with it, what looks to be very likely the losing the front wing that they had that was offering some through corner balance advantage. And then, after, was it about Spain? Their top speed picks up a little bit, which was, they start off the season as the slowest car in a straight line. Their Saturday qualifying performances were reasonable. Ferrari was still better, I think, throughout. But on Sunday, the Aston was there. They had a lot of downforce on the car. The car was stable and it was good on the tires. And then after that, it kind of went away. And it looked like also once the car got more difficult as a function of, as we speculate, losing some of those trick bits, Lance also struggled quite a bit more with the car. And then towards the end of the season, the car is more competitive again. They've understood what they need to do over a 10 race period and in development. And Lance is looking a little bit more comfortable in the car again. And then they're scoring, a handful of points here and there. But I don't think they're nowhere close to back to where they were at the start of the season, where it was podium, 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 podium. And but the big changes for them were that mid-season, which looks like the flexi front wing, huge changes to how you have to set up the car, operate the car. And you might not have the tools to put the car right back in the window. If you lose an aerodynamic bit, there's mechanical changes that you can make, but they don't do the exact same things. And a lot of times, in order to find performance, you need to put load on the car in very specific states, not just everywhere. But I think at the end of the season, I don't know. It's hard for me to say, are they going to be back and competitive at the start of next season again? Really tough to say. What did you think about the end of that trajectory? Because we talked quite a bit, John, about their mid-season loss of form surrounding the controversy with the front wings and the FIA technical directive. Where did you see that heading?
I think what's interesting is, because they talked about side effects, basically, they sent the development of the car in one direction. Because obviously your wind tunnel CFD is showing you that there's performance coming from new parts. You develop them, you introduce them. And then, again, these tyres, such a fine line between a car that's in balance and not in balance, and a car that's quick in qualifying on one compound and may not like another compound, and then the races. And so it's very tricky to have your aggressive development path and not lose sight of some of the strengths of the car as you push it on. And I thought it was very interesting, the end of the year, when Andreas Stella talked about McLaren, which had this stellar second half of the season, suddenly saw some blips of performance and difficulties in qualifying, like Lando in Abu Dhabi with the Wasp. And he talked about there potentially being questions for McLaren about whether upgrades they'd introduced had created some traits with these cars. So I sense with these cars that they are complicated beasts, and it's very easy to be in the window and out the window. And if you're shifting things around and the car's not in the right place, is the driver able to do it? And Fernando Alonso, I think, is a bit like Max in terms of he has his mouse at 100% sensitivity, very easily able to do it. And Lance, I think, struggled with that. Doesn't like the kind of the very loose rear end. One driver said to me, if you go on YouTube and watch some onboard footage of Fernando Alonso at Monza, for example, and you can just see how he's almost drifting the car through the Lesmo corners, very loose rear end. He says that highlights, the knife edge that these cars are operating on. And if the driver's not happy, the tyre balance is out, they're sliding the tyres a bit more, then the performance is knocking off, you're pushing harder, you're overheating the tyres more. It's this same virtual circle. You get in the window, everything's brilliant, and that's what Aston Martin found at the start of the year. That car in Bahrain, and we'll still go back. I still remember that graph you had of Fernando Alonso's long run in the Bahrain test that was like nothing we'd seen before. That was the epitome sweet spot of where they are, and it followed through pretty much to the race. And it lost that direction. And also, the other factor that can't be ignored is a mid-season switch of factory. I know the team said this was all great, having these new facilities, but there's got to be disruptive. These teams you're working flat out to improve. You slack off for 1 day or 2 days or a week, stop development, is going to have consequences. So I think there was a slight disruption. I think even for us, if we move office the middle of the year and we're just writing stories and having to move computers, is disruptive. So for a Formula One team, it's got to have had a little bit of an impact, having done it mid-season rather than waiting for the winter.
I have to completely agree with that. I remember when we would do a desk reshuffle at Red Bull, and I was like, oh no, I've got a simulator session to play. Like you said, though, the season is flat out. It's so many events. You don't, the back to races. Stuff like having a whole factory changing desks. There's going to be something that's lost in, losing 5 hours in the middle of the week, considering people are absolutely flat out throughout the whole thing. So, and back to the operational efficiency. Yeah, You've got to suggest that it might hurt. I think another thing on the Aston thing is, development is really difficult to impact, especially when we're talking about aero. The lead time on going from an idea of I need to put performance on the car here to seeing that performance on the track and validating it in a free practice session is one thing. But imagine you've had a development path through the whole season, and then you change something at the front of the car massively that you didn't anticipate changing. That's got to wreak havoc on, months and months of work in CFD in the wind tunnel to be like, right, well, we don't have that thing anymore. Let's rebuild the car around this, and lots of new lessons to learn.
There's also an important factor. I still come back to when you look at Ferrari's season is there's a difference between, and this is what they found out. It's what Carlos Sainz helped them with at the Spanish Grand Prix. Is there's a difference between what the data's saying and the computer's saying about this is the sweet spot for the setup. This is our ride height. This is how stiff the suspension needs to be. This is what we're doing. And Carlos was saying, no, if we run that low, that's stiff. The car's bouncing under braking. It's very nervous. It's loosening. The tires are sliding. It's worse. We need to lift the car up a little bit, make it a bit softer, make it more compliant. And the theoretical lap time loss from that, sure, there's the computer will say you don't want to do that. But then the gain the driver can have, A, from confidence, B, being able to push harder, C, looking after the tires, actually outweighs the theoretical difference. And I think that's what kind of unlocked a path for Ferrari that you can then track through to the Singapore Grand Prix. So there's also an element that the work at the factory isn't giving you 100% of the answers like it could do in the past about these cars, because you've got these huge fluctuations of performance. You've got to basically choose where you position your sweet spot with ride height. Are you chasing the low speed, the high speed, the medium speed? Where do you want to have your compromises? And I think we've seen teams like Aston Martin, like Ferrari and AlphaTauri in particular. You go chasing one direction and it improves, but it ends up compromising you somewhere else.
And in part 2, we will talk specifically about the drivers. You mentioned Lando Norris there, which we will get into talking about driver performances in the second part of this video. Stay tuned to the channel to make sure that you catch that. Now, before we go, we will get both your thoughts on the lower half of the grid. Now, it will sting Alpine and everyone working there for me to say in the lower half of the grid, but you can't get away from their performances. Alpine have big ambitions, but haven't delivered yet, and had some big changes themselves, personnel-wise, through this season. But also AlphaTauri, whatever they'll be called next year, Alfa Romeo, as was Sauber, and Williams and Haas as well. Before we go, some interesting storylines down the bottom half of the grid. Blake doesn't always get the most attention because of the talking points, but you still run the data and you find some interesting stuff in there.
Yeah, Alpine was one of the interesting ones, and of course, if you've got, if you're moving factory and that can impact your workflow, changing management, chief technical people, that will obviously have an impact on a season. And Alpine, we showed up in winter testing thinking they were sandbagging, and then there or thereabouts they were looking reasonable. But throughout the season, if you look at their qualifying pace, they basically just hung on to the development curve. They didn't open up the gap, but they didn't get better. Whereas, McLaren, even AlphaTauri had a huge improvement from the start of the season from a bad place. Realistically, they were super variable in qualifying. They had very strange results in Baku and Italy, which is strange for Alpine because last year they were this low drag, low downforce efficiency machine. And this season, they look like that sometimes, and they'll run, way high in the speed traps compared to everybody else. But then you go to these low efficiency or high efficiency circuits, and they've got a lot more downforce on the car than everybody else, and they're slower. So there's something weird going on there. In terms of high speed performance, they've lost out relative to everybody else in qualifying in single lap pace. They've not been able to put any performance on there. So it's a bit of a head scratcher. And I know I'm missing some of the information on this, but I'm really confused about their consistency. And the other thing that John mentioned about single lap qualifying pace is if you struggle on a specific compound or tire and you don't get that tire in the window and you're not able to prep that tire right to get the most out of qualifying, you can have those qualifying performances where they're absolutely in the mud and struggling to get out of Q1 sometimes. So that is kind of a very roundabout way of wrapping up Alpine's season.
I think that the difficulty is that the midfield pack is just so ridiculously competitive. You're talking 2 temps, the difference between dumped out in Q1 and getting all the way through to Q3 and rolling the dice and potentially starting P5. And I think Alpine in particular struggled on certain compound tyres more than others. And I don't know if they were compromised by engine being down on power. They tried to get it addressed, or the FIA looked into it, but Alpine elected not to chase it. But you're down on power, you have to take some wing off, not as quick in the corners. And it's, again, this circle of every element needs to stack up and be ticked. And I think also against that backdrop, mid-season, kind of the overhaul of the team faced at Spa, new team principal, change at the top, all the kind of background has to unsettle the team a little bit. And it made progress, but also some strange flashpoints. Pierre Gasly and Ocon just on track, a lot of shenanigans, team radio, fun, all that sort of thing. Didn't point to a unified team all pointing in the same direction at times, but maybe a winter and a refocus and a push forwards will help address it.
And finally, before we go, we saw some other interesting storylines. Williams had some good pace at times this year. Blake, Alfa Romeo had some okay pace at times this year. And then I sort of look, they'd be pit stopping already, and you're like, oh, your tyre's gone already. Same with Haas as well at times, I guess. And looking at AlphaTauri, I wonder if we saw any bits on that car that perhaps could be useful to Red Bull next year, whether they're using any kind of partnership they've got and whether that team kind of continues in its current guise. No real driver drama, but we'll get on that in part two. But whether they can use that to just bolster the main Red Bull team, anything that can be learned from there, because all of those teams I've mentioned had glimpses of sort of decency this year.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you look at the pace improvement from the first half to the second half of the season on single lap only, and I think we saw it also in the race results, AlphaTauri were quite impressive. They added a load of low and medium speed performance to the car relative to the other teams, which was one of the most impressive gains. So despite the fact, in terms of results, they didn't look that great overall this season, but they did make a huge jump up the field in terms of how far they were off of pole in terms of percentage lap time in qualifying. Their performance improvement was not dissimilar to McLaren's. However, their starting place was much further back, so I don't really feel like that got as much excitement and hype. When you go from, nowhere to getting on the podiums, fine, but when you go from the back to, consistently able to get in a point scoring position, that changes things quite a bit. So I feel like they probably didn't get as much hype as they deserved this season. And also maybe a little bit that's down to the driver arrangement in the second half of the season with Ricciardo coming in. And to be fair, Lawson doing a very damn good job for those couple of races he filled in. But I think that's quite impressive. I think Williams was another interesting one. Albon drove the crap out of that car that season. Honestly, man, it was super impressive. From the data, it doesn't look like they made any huge improvements in terms of characteristics. Not a lot of downforce on that car, which is very obvious. Their top speeds are competitive usually, but they're not particularly strong in low speed either, which I feel like leaves a lot of places for Williams to focus and see if they can improve. Logan had a tough season for sure, but hopefully a second year in that car will give him a lot more time to develop and learn from Alex, who is insanely impressive.
Yeah, I think the story of Williams v AlphaTauri on track is, as we mentioned, these cars, some cars like low speed, high speed, some cars like medium speed and operate. And I think that those two cars operated in different areas. The Williams loved long straights, braking in a straight line, short corners, basically. So if you go to venues, long high speed corners or long combinations of corners or not braking in a straight line, it wasn't very good. And that explained the fluctuation. It was very, very down to characteristics. And AlphaTauri, the Red Bull collaboration, is obvious. The team's fairly open. They're going to, you're part of a revamp, the restructure of the team. They're going to take as much as they can off the Red Bull next season as they're allowed by the regulations. Same as Haas. I think the step they made from Singapore when they took the RB19 suspension as part of the aerodynamic revamp, showed what's possible. And rivals obviously don't like teams making big steps like this. So there's always the concerns and voices about, there's collaboration, it's unfair. But I think it's a lot of hot air over nothing really, because if teams having this collaboration were both benefit each other and pushing forwards, Ferrari and Haas are got exactly the same relationship. Haas takes as much customer parts off Ferrari. Haas finished 10th in the Constructors this year. Ferrari didn't win it. So if this was a golden route to success, those two teams, in theory would have been up there because they were working the closest so far. And the FIA says, it looks at everything. It checks parts. Teams that it knows are collaborating. It pays even greater scrutiny. If there's front wing developments, it goes to have a look. It traces back how it's got developed, where it's got developed. There's no scope. And we spoke to Nicholas Tombazis in Abu Dhabi, and he said actually the problem isn't teams under the obvious public spotlight like Red Bull, AlphaTauri, Haas, Ferrari, because they're publicly collaborating. They know what they're allowed to do. The difficulty could be teams operating alone, secret Zoom chats with other engineers, and all these private meetings they know nothing about. So there are avenues open to doing it, but it's not. There's nothing dodgy going on between Red Bull, AlphaTauri, Haas, Ferrari, because it's so public. The FIA's policing is pretty robust, and I think if two cars rocked up identically, it would be fairly obvious to everybody else what was going on.
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting things. For the longest time, Toro Rosso and AlphaTauri tried to be quite independent and have their own, identity in terms of how they develop the car. But at the same time, when you are a company that you own two teams and you see one team kind of doing their own thing, and maybe as a result, directly or not, having less than stellar performances, it's like, you're legally allowed to take these things. Please take them. Yes, you still have to do all the aerodynamic development around it, and you have to understand what that does, but that's a completely different thing. And it just takes, it's like, right, you don't need suspension, you don't need 20 suspension designers or 10 suspension designers, whatever. Put those guys on aero where the performance is. There's no performance in, I say that there's no performance in suspension, and we say that they've got the RB9 suspension, they've done better. It's like, this thing works, take that. That's legal. That was one of the whole things is, the standard parts. It's like, it's to make this more accessible and easy for other teams. But and that's the AlphaTauri story. But the same thing is Haas, in terms of single lap pace, were 7th best, consistently very, very quick. And then they go on to finish. So maybe there is something that, the idea of if you take someone's suspension, that's great, but you still have to develop a car from every other aspect, especially aerodynamically, that complements that suspension. And if you can't do that, you will have a car that maybe is great on one lap, but it's so peaky that you can't keep the tires on the car after 5 laps. So it's not like you said, it's complete to your point, John, it's not a freebie. It still requires the teams to do a lot of creativity, a lot of work.
Yeah, no doubt. Still great people working at those teams. They might be lower down the grid, but fantastic talent working there. And development all the way through to the end of the season. We saw that new floor on the AlphaTauri in Abu Dhabi. Strong result for Yuki. Daniel just outside of the points as the season finished off. And so even to the end, they might not be fighting for the championship if we see loads of development going on up and down the grid. That's the first part of our show, which will split into 2 parts. The teams, and then we'll look at the drivers. We'll do driver ratings. Not a 1 to 10 score, but we'll look at the driver partnerships. And we'll look at what 2024 could bring in part 2. So if you're not subscribed to the channel already, then make sure you are, because we can see people are watching this who aren't yet subscribed. So click that button, click it, give us a thumbs up if you like the video, and we'll make more just like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in part 2.